What happens when Beyoncé's mother, Tina Knowles, steps into the swirling chaos of royal drama? Imagine a woman who has built one of the most successful global icons of all time. A mother who knows about fame, fortune, betrayal, business, and family, suddenly offering advice that seems to cut straight through the carefully maintained image of Meghan Markle. Now, ask yourself this. Was Tina giving motherly wisdom, or was she slyly, almost hilariously, taking Meghan down a notch on her own podcast? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. That's the question that has electrified both royal commentators and Beyoncé fans alike. Because this wasn't just a casual chit-chat about family values. No, this was a moment where two worlds collided. The House of Windsor, with all its fractured relationships, and the House of Knowles, with its reputation for loyalty, unity, and hard-earned respect. And caught in the middle was Meghan Markle, a woman whose public image is built on control and narrative, suddenly being faced with advice she could not ignore. But before we dive into Tina's subtle yet devastating remarks, let's step back. Why does this matter now? Why are people suddenly re-listening to this podcast episode from June? Why are Meghan's family troubles once again front and center? And most importantly, what does Tina Knowles' laughter-filled advice reveal about the Duchess who has spent years at war with her own blood? Picture this: Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, sitting across from Tina Knowles during a special bonus episode of her podcast, Confessions of a Female Founder. Meghan is calm, collected, polished. She knows the cameras aren't rolling, but the microphones are. Every word matters. She sees Tina not just as Beyoncé's mother, but as a powerful businesswoman, philanthropist, and matriarch. This is supposed to be an episode that adds credibility to Meghan's brand, a way to rub shoulders with another cultural titan. But Tina has her own way of speaking. She doesn't lecture. She doesn't grandstand. She drops wisdom casually, almost with a smile. And in that calm, almost playful voice, she tells Meghan that when she and Beyoncé disagree, she always apologizes. Always. Even if she thinks she's right. Even if she knows she's right. Why? Because it's Beyoncé's business. Because it's about family. Because peace is worth more than ego. Now pause right there. Did you feel it? That sting? That twist of irony? Because here's Meghan Markle, a woman estranged from her father, at odds with her siblings, at war with her in-laws, being told that sometimes you have to swallow your pride and apologize, even when you don't want to. That's not just advice. That's a spotlight. That's a mirror. That's Tina Knowles, without even naming names, holding up an example of family loyalty that Meghan has never quite managed to deliver. And that's where the tension begins. Because Meghan, for all her polished words and curated public image, has been defined as much by her broken family ties as by her Hollywood and royal connections. She cut off her father, Thomas Markle Sr., even as he begged to see his grandchildren. She clashed with her half-siblings, who have turned into her most vocal critics. She and Harry burned bridges with William and Kate, leaving the once Fab Four fractured and frosty. Meghan has built her empire on independence, but that independence has come at the cost of reconciliation. So when Tina Knowles casually says, "We have disagreements about things, but it's her business. I always give in and apologize," it lands differently. It's not just a throwaway line. It's a masterclass in shade, gentle, maternal, and devastating all at once. Think about it. Beyoncé is one of the most powerful women in the world. She doesn't need her mother to bend. She doesn't need her mother to apologize. But Tina does it anyway. Why? Because keeping family unity intact is more important than being right. That's the exact opposite of Meghan's playbook. Meghan has consistently chosen the fight, chosen distance, chosen to protect her pride instead of extending an olive branch. And this is why Sarah Hewson, royal commentator for the Sun's royal exclusive show, immediately jumped on the moment. She called Tina's words valuable advice for Meghan. Valuable advice. That phrase almost sounds polite, doesn't it? But under the surface, it's loaded. It means Meghan needed it. It means Meghan lacked it. It means the podcast episode wasn't just about women in business. It became a lesson in family values. Now here's the twist. Meghan invited Tina. Meghan wanted Tina. Meghan wanted the credibility and cultural cachet of Beyoncé's mom on her podcast. But what she got was something else. A public schooling, wrapped in velvet, dipped in humor, and delivered with a smile. And that's why this story still resonates months later. Because Tina Knowles didn't scream, didn't accuse, didn't humiliate. She did something far worse. She exposed, with elegance and grace, the one thing Meghan Markle cannot control: her broken family narrative. Let's talk about why this hurts Meghan more than any tabloid headline ever could. Meghan has always insisted that her family drama is private. She has framed her estrangement as necessary, protective, even noble. She's positioned herself as the victim of a toxic father and half-siblings who betrayed her for money. She's painted the royal family as cold, uncaring, and even cruel. In Meghan's narrative, the world is always against her. But Tina's advice flips that narrative. It says, sometimes it's not about who's right or wrong. Sometimes it's about giving in, apologizing, and moving forward. That's a universal truth. That's motherly wisdom. And Meghan can't argue with it without looking petty. She can't brush it off without confirming what critics already believe: that she doesn't want peace, only control. And so we arrive at the heart of the matter. Why does this story matter now? Because in a world where Meghan and Harry's popularity has plummeted, where their Netflix deal is under scrutiny, where their public image is fragile, Tina Knowles' soft jab is like pouring salt into an open wound. It reminds people that Meghan's life, no matter how glamorous, is haunted by estrangement. It reminds people that while Beyoncé's family thrives together, Meghan's family crumbles apart. Do you see the irony? Beyoncé, the global superstar with unimaginable pressure, manages to maintain harmony with her mother. Meghan, the self-styled survivor of royal life, cannot keep a single family bond intact beyond Harry and Doria. And here's where I ask you directly: was Tina's comment innocent advice, or was it a carefully crafted moment of shade? Do you think Tina, a woman who has navigated the brutal entertainment industry for decades, didn't know exactly what she was saying? Or do you believe it was unintentional, a slip of wisdom that just happened to slice through Meghan's armor? Think about it. Tina has been around too long not to understand the weight of her words. She knows Meghan's history. She knows Meghan's headlines. She knows exactly how the world would interpret her remarks. And perhaps, just perhaps, she wanted Meghan, and the millions listening, to hear that message loud and clear. But here's the kicker. Meghan didn't flinch. At least, not outwardly. She smiled, she nodded, she moved on. But what was happening beneath the surface? Did Meghan feel that sting in the moment? Did she realize her own guest had just handed her a lesson in front of the world? Or was she too focused on curating her podcast persona to notice the silent storm brewing? That's the brilliance of Tina's delivery. She didn't need to confront Meghan head-on. She simply held up a mirror. And whether Meghan chose to look into it, well, that's another story entirely. Now, before we move forward, let's plant this seed. Meghan has spent years running from reconciliation. With her father, with her siblings, with her in-laws. Every door closed, every bridge burned, every olive branch snapped. But what if Tina Knowles' advice wasn't just casual? What if it was a warning? A roadmap Meghan refuses to follow? A signal that without humility, without apology, without reconciliation, her empire will collapse under the weight of isolation. Because make no mistake, in the world of celebrity, family matters. Unity matters. Appearances matter. And when the woman who raised Beyoncé tells you that sometimes you have to apologize even when you're right, maybe, just maybe, she's saying something Meghan desperately needs to hear. But here's where the story takes a sharp turn. Because Tina's words weren't just about Meghan and her family. No, they had echoes far beyond that podcast studio. They carried across the Atlantic, through the royal palaces, through the media, through the whispers of commentators. And suddenly, what began as a casual chat turned into something much bigger. A message, a comparison, a cultural clash. And that's where we head next. Because what Tina Knowles said about family unity wasn't just an innocent comment. It was the spark that reignited debates about Meghan's father, her siblings, and her royal in-laws. It pulled ghosts out of the shadows. It made the world ask, If Beyoncé's mom can laugh off disagreements and apologize, why can't Meghan Markle? But the real question is this: what happened next? When the world replayed Tina's words over and over, dissecting them, twisting them, and turning them into a weapon, that's where the story truly explodes. So let me ask you this: how much power can a single podcast conversation hold? We live in a world where words don't just vanish into the air. They echo. They get clipped, shared, dissected, turned into headlines. And when Meghan Markle sat down with Tina Knowles for that bonus episode of her podcast, she probably thought she was in full control. But was she? Or did she accidentally hand the microphone and the power to Beyoncé's mother? Let's rewind to that moment. June. Meghan's podcast Confessions of a Female Founder had already seen its ups and downs. Some listeners loved the idea of Meghan exploring women's stories and leadership. Others thought it was polished PR masquerading as authenticity. But then came the special bonus episode with Tina Knowles. On paper, it looked perfect. Meghan teaming up with a woman who raised one of the most iconic performers on earth. That's credibility. That's star power. That's the kind of guest who makes people sit up and say, "Okay, now I'm listening." But here's the twist. Tina Knowles didn't just come to play the role of proud mama. She came with her own energy. She came with wisdom that can't be rehearsed. She came with the kind of candor that cuts deeper than royal gossip ever could. Picture the setup. Meghan greets Tina warmly. There's polite laughter, introductions, the kind of easy banter that podcasts live on. Meghan has her questions ready about business, about building brands, about motherhood. She wants her audience to see Tina as a role model for female founders. She wants her audience to see herself in Tina's glow. But here's the contradiction. When you invite someone who has built an empire alongside Beyoncé, you're not the star anymore. You're the student. And Meghan, a woman who has built her life on controlling the narrative, suddenly wasn't holding the reins. Let's explore the contradictions here. Meghan's brand is built on compassion, on advocacy, on the narrative of healing. She's the champion of women, children, and families. She presents herself as someone who can navigate complex emotional terrain with grace. Yet, in her own family, she has repeatedly chosen distance over dialogue. She has allowed pride to overshadow connection. And in that moment, Tina's philosophy, humility, apology, compromise, directly contradicted everything Meghan's public persona claims to represent. The irony is almost cinematic. Here's Meghan, in a controlled environment, seated with a woman whose family thrives on connection, receiving wisdom she cannot easily argue against. Tina's approach is simple yet profound. Prioritize relationships over ego. Meghan's history with her father demonstrates the opposite. Prioritize ego, control, and self-preservation over familial bonds. The contrast is stark. Now, consider the emotional weight for Meghan. Every listener of that podcast episode, every royal commentator, every fan who knew her family story, could sense the subtext. Tina's words were a quiet accusation wrapped in the velvet glove of advice. The statement, "I always give in and apologize," resonates like a ticking clock for Meghan, reminding her of a father who has waited decades for a simple act of reconciliation that never came. Thomas Markle Sr.'s attempts to reconnect are well documented. He has expressed regret over his mistakes, especially surrounding the intense media coverage during the royal wedding. He has shared personal letters, interviews, and even made gestures toward public acknowledgement of his grandchildren. And yet, Meghan has maintained distance. The public perception? A daughter unwilling to forgive, unwilling to reach out, unwilling to reconcile. Tina's advice casts a harsh spotlight on this estrangement, implying that healing is possible, if only Meghan would set aside her pride. But let's also acknowledge the complexity here. Meghan's estrangement from her father is not without nuance. She has claimed that his interactions with the media were intrusive and damaging. She has stated, through interviews and her own public appearances, that she needed to protect her family from exposure and scrutiny. There's an argument to be made for her caution. But here's the key. Tina's philosophy doesn't ignore caution. It doesn't suggest reckless vulnerability. It simply says, prioritize the relationship, even if it means swallowing pride, even if it feels uncomfortable, even if you are right. And that's the challenge for Meghan. She is a woman who has spent decades learning to navigate power, control, and public perception. She knows how to protect her image. She knows how to manage narratives. But when faced with Tina's words, she is confronted with something beyond image control. She is confronted with ethics, morality, and family responsibility, areas where public relations and strategy cannot shield her. Let's pause for a moment. How does a person process that? Imagine being Meghan in that moment, listening to a mother share wisdom about family, all while knowing that your own father waits at home, unacknowledged, unheard, unseen. The emotional pressure is immense. Pride clashes with responsibility. Ego clashes with legacy. And the audience, they are watching, listening, waiting for a sign, any sign, of reflection or remorse. And then there's the media echo. Tina's advice didn't stay confined to the podcast. It ricocheted across the internet, through social media platforms, and into tabloids and news cycles. Headlines framed it as a direct commentary on Meghan's family failures. Royal experts dissected her reactions, noting every pause, every nod, every subtle expression for insight into her state of mind. The moment became a public referendum on Meghan's ability, or unwillingness, to reconcile with her father. Here's another layer to consider. Meghan's children, Archie and Lilibet. They are caught in the middle of this family web. Thomas Markle Sr. has expressed a desire to meet them, to build a relationship. Tina's advice implies that bridging gaps, making gestures, apologizing, these are not just acts for adults. They are acts that ripple down generations, shaping the emotional landscape of children who deserve connection and family stability. Meghan's decision to withhold contact has consequences far beyond her own ego. Now, let's juxtapose this with Beyoncé's family model. Beyoncé and Tina maintain a strong, enduring bond. They disagree. They resolve. They apologize. They prioritize love over ego. Tina's statement, simple and calm, illustrates the difference between a family that survives public scrutiny and one that crumbles under it. Meghan Markle, in contrast, presents a public image of independence and empowerment, but struggles to translate those ideals into her own family relationships. And the audience feels that contrast. They see the tension. They recognize the irony. They hear Tina's calm voice offering a lesson Meghan cannot argue with, and they juxtapose it with Meghan's estranged father, pleading in the media, denied the chance to form a bond with his grandchildren. The narrative writes itself, and Meghan becomes the case study of pride overriding reconciliation. But here's the kicker. Meghan's response during the podcast was carefully controlled. She nodded. She smiled. She acknowledged the wisdom. Yet the silence between words speaks volumes. That's where the emotional tension lies. Tina delivered her philosophy. Meghan remained composed. But the undercurrent is undeniable. Meghan was confronted with her father's absence, her own estrangement, and a stark example of how family could function differently, or without Tina ever pointing a finger directly at her. And that brings us to the real drama of this chapter. How do you respond when advice exposes your deepest failings? When a conversation meant to inspire instead illuminates a lifetime of unresolved conflict? Meghan was faced with a choice: reflect, act, or continue avoiding. Each option carries weight. Each option is public. Each option affects not only her legacy but the perception of her family, her marriage, and her children. Ask yourself, if you were Meghan, what would you do? Would you apologize, extend a hand, and attempt reconciliation? Or would you maintain distance, protect your narrative, and hope the public forgets? And in the age of social media, where nothing is private and every gesture is analyzed, is avoiding the confrontation truly an option? But what came next in Meghan's family saga, the ripple effects from this simple podcast moment, would make the stakes even higher. Because Tina's advice didn't just illuminate her relationship with her father. It cast a light on her siblings, her in-laws, and even her marriage. Every bridge Meghan has avoided building became more visible, more scrutinized, and more urgent. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to have family ties strained to the breaking point? To know that every interaction, every message, Every passing comment could ignite yet another public feud. For Meghan Markle, that's been reality for years. Her half-siblings, Thomas Markle Jr. and Samantha Markle, have transformed what should have been private disputes into daily media fodder, amplifying a family feud that few outsiders can fully comprehend. And yet, Tina Knowles' podcast advice, apologize, give in, prioritize family, cuts through all of that, offering a perspective Meghan seems unable or unwilling to embrace. Let's start with Samantha Markle. She has made headlines repeatedly, often appearing on talk shows and giving interviews that criticize Meghan's decisions. She has accused Meghan of abandoning her family, of turning her back on her roots, and of controlling narrative for personal gain. Every comment, every interview, every social media post has been another brick in a wall that separates the half-sisters. And while Samantha speaks out, Meghan maintains distance, carefully curating her public persona, defending her choices, and shielding herself from the media backlash. Then there's Thomas Markle Jr., whose occasional comments have echoed a similar sentiment. His words may be less frequent, but are no less impactful. He has lamented the lack of communication, expressed disappointment in public forums, and indirectly challenged Meghan's narrative of family loyalty. Each statement serves as a reminder that estrangement is mutual, and that every feud is a reflection of choices made, or avoided, in moments of personal accountability. Now imagine Tina Knowles' words cutting through all of that. I always give in and apologize. The simplicity of that statement belies its profound implications. Because when Meghan listens to Tina, she is forced to consider the siblings she has sidelined, the voices she has ignored, and the bridges she has refused to mend. It's a reminder that estrangement is a choice, and that reconciliation requires humility, a concept Meghan has repeatedly avoided. And yet, Meghan's podcast persona is built on empowerment, advocacy, and leadership. She presents herself as someone capable of managing complex situations, inspiring women, and championing causes with moral clarity. But when applied to her own family, those skills seem to falter. Tina's advice exposes the gap between image and reality, between aspiration and practice. It's one thing to speak about conflict management in theory. It's another to apply it to relationships where emotion, history, and public scrutiny collide. Here's the irony. Meghan has often spoken about protecting her family, her children, and her privacy. She frames estrangement as a necessary shield, a defense against toxicity. But Tina's message flips that narrative. Apologizing, giving in, prioritizing relationships, these are not signs of weakness. They are strategies for preserving family unity. And for Meghan, that's a lesson she cannot ignore. It's not just advice. It's a challenge to reconsider the decisions that have shaped her family dynamic. And the consequences of ignoring that advice are visible in the media. Every interview, every social media post, every public comment from Samantha or Thomas Jr. becomes a reminder that bridges remain unbuilt, connections remain severed, and the public sees a family divided. Tina's philosophy, in contrast, offers a path to harmony, a framework Meghan has consistently sidestepped. The contrast is impossible to miss. But it's not just about siblings. The fallout extends to Meghan's in-laws as well. Her relationship with Prince William and Kate, Princess of Wales, has been widely reported as strained. Since stepping down as working royals in 2020, Meghan and Harry have maintained a distance from the core royal family, creating a narrative of isolation and conflict. Tina's advice resonates here too. Prioritize relationships, even when difficult. Apologize, bend, compromise. The lessons of familial loyalty are universal, transcending culture, wealth, and status. Now let's add another layer, public perception. Meghan's estrangement from her siblings has been a topic of fascination for tabloids, talk shows, and social media. Every feud is amplified, every dispute dissected, every slight broadcast globally. Tina's words, subtle and strategic, highlight the irony. A woman who preaches family values to the world struggles to implement those same principles in her own life. The contrast is stark, almost painful to witness. And there's a human element too. Beyond the media spectacle, there are real feelings at stake. Estranged siblings experience grief, frustration, and longing. There are missed holidays, unshared milestones, and unspoken words. Tina's advice, apologize, give in, prioritize family, isn't just about optics. It's about healing emotional wounds that fester when pride eclipses compassion. Meghan, in ignoring this wisdom, leaves a trail of unhealed wounds that affect not just herself, but everyone around her. Consider this. What if Meghan had approached her siblings differently? What if she had taken Tina's advice to heart years ago? Could some of the public criticism have been avoided? Could her image as a compassionate, empowered leader have been reinforced rather than questioned? The what ifs are endless, and they haunt every media narrative about her family. And yet, the drama doesn't stop there. Because even as Meghan maintains distance, the public narrative continues to evolve. Tina's advice circulates, reshaping perception. Analysts compare the Markle family to the Knowles family, highlighting the power of reconciliation versus the cost of estrangement. Social media users debate whether Meghan's choices reflect strength or stubbornness, wisdom or insecurity. Every discussion reinforces the same point. Family loyalty matters, humility matters, and ignoring those principles comes at a cost. Ask yourself this. How does a person like Meghan respond when the world is comparing her family to a family that thrives on unity? How do you defend estrangement when a global icon like Tina Knowles demonstrates a model of loyalty, apology, and love that's both simple and profound? That's the tension Meghan faced during that podcast, a tension that doesn't fade once the microphones are turned off. And here's the twist that nobody could ignore. Tina's words, simple as they were, didn't just comment on Meghan's estrangement from her father or siblings. They implicitly challenged her approach to conflict in all areas of life: friends, marriage, business, and public perception. It was a soft but powerful critique, delivered with calm authority. Meghan could smile, nod, and move on in the moment, but the ripple effect was unavoidable. The lesson had been delivered, and the world would keep watching to see if she learned it. But just when you think the tension can't get any higher, the next revelation hits. One that makes the sibling feud look almost tame in comparison. Because Tina's words weren't just advice. They were a prelude to scrutiny that would soon include the royals, the media, and the public alike. And what Meghan faced next would test every lesson Tina had imparted. Have you ever seen a family feud play out on a global stage? Because that's what Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's situation has become. While Tina Knowles' advice to apologize and prioritize relationships subtly highlighted Meghan's estranged Markles, it also forced a glaring spotlight onto her relationships with the British royals, relationships that have become increasingly strained since Megxit in 2020. And in that podcast moment, the contrast couldn't have been more stark. Tina's words were about family loyalty, reconciliation, and humility, while Meghan's real-life choices reflected distance, estrangement, and calculated separation. Let's begin with the facts. Prince Harry and Meghan stepped down as working royals, citing media intrusion, lack of privacy, and mental health concerns. This unprecedented move shocked the monarchy, ignited global headlines, and fundamentally altered the royal landscape. But while they sought independence, the fallout extended far beyond their personal choices. Relationships with Prince William, Kate, and even King Charles became tense, sometimes icy, often silent. Every public appearance, every interview, every comment in the media added fuel to the fire. And Meghan? She found herself navigating not only her own family issues but also the intricate web of royal expectations and scrutiny. Now, imagine Tina Knowles' advice echoing in that context. I always give in and apologize. Think about it. If Meghan applied that principle to her estrangement from the royals, history might have looked very different. A simple gesture of apology, humility, or compromise could have softened tensions, repaired trust, or at least signaled goodwill. Instead, the decision was made to step away, creating a divide that remains a source of media fascination. Tina's words, though intended as general advice about family disputes, suddenly cast Meghan's royal choices in a harsher light. Let's break it down. Prince William and Kate were reportedly hurt by the decision to step back. Privately, sources suggest there was disappointment, frustration, and even feelings of betrayal. Publicly, the narrative became more controlled, more diplomatic, but the undercurrent of tension was palpable. Meghan's choice to distance herself mirrored the estrangement she maintained with her own father and siblings. The pattern is undeniable: conflict avoidance, image management, and distance as a form of control. Tina's advice, though subtle, highlighted the absence of reconciliation in every facet of Meghan's life. And it gets more lead. The media immediately began drawing comparisons. They juxtaposed Meghan's estrangement from her American family with her distancing from the British royal family. The question became inevitable. Is this a woman who cannot reconcile, or is it a woman who has learned to manage relationships strategically? Public perception leaned toward the former. The podcast clips circulated widely, with headlines emphasizing the irony of a woman preaching empowerment while avoiding reconciliation at every turn. Ask yourself this: what does it feel like to be constantly scrutinized for family decisions? To know that your personal disputes are dissected on global news outlets, on social media, in talk shows, and podcasts. For Meghan, this is reality. Every action, or inaction, is magnified, analyzed, and judged. Tina Knowles' simple words, delivered casually in a podcast, became another lens through which the public viewed her choices. And there's a psychological angle, too. Tina's advice implicitly questioned Meghan's approach to conflict. It suggested that family loyalty, humility, and compromise are stronger than pride, ego, and distance. Meghan, in maintaining her estrangement from both sides of a family, is now faced with a public lesson in emotional intelligence she can't ignore. The irony is stark. A podcast conversation meant to showcase Meghan's influence ends up highlighting her most glaring relational failures. Meanwhile, the royal rift had other complications. Reports suggested that communication between the Sussexes and the palace remained limited. Invitations to family events were met with hesitation or declined entirely. Media coverage speculated endlessly about unspoken tensions, about private grievances, and about what it would take to heal the divide. Each passing year seemed to cement distance rather than reconciliation. Tina's advice, once again, offered a roadmap Meghan has largely ignored. Apologize. Give in. Prioritize relationships. Simple. Effective. Yet in the royal context, these principles are still absent. And then there's the media's role. British tabloids, American outlets, and global news channels seized on every opportunity to frame the Sussexes' choices as estrangement, betrayal, or defiance. Every public appearance, every interview, every philanthropic endeavor was dissected for its impact on family relations. Tina Knowles' words became a subtle, unrelenting counterpoint. Here is a woman who models loyalty and humility, and here is Meghan, whose avoidance of reconciliation is now a matter of public scrutiny. Let's talk emotion for a second. Imagine being Meghan in that environment. You are aware that your father is estranged, your siblings are vocal critics, and your in-laws are at a distance. Every choice is a headline. Every interaction is amplified. And then you are reminded, subtly but unmistakably, that conflict could be resolved, relationships could be repaired, and bridges could be rebuilt, if only humility and apology were applied. That's pressure most people could never comprehend. And here's the twist. While the podcast moment seemed benign, it rippled outward, influencing how commentators discussed Meghan and Harry's royal departure. Analysts compared Tina Knowles' approach to Meghan's behavior, framing the Sussexes' distance as a failure to embrace reconciliation. Headlines hinted at irony. A woman advocating for women's empowerment simultaneously struggles to apply the same principles to family life. The conversation wasn't just about American family estrangement anymore. It was about the royal family, public perception, and the global narrative surrounding Meghan and Harry. So now we have multiple layers of tension. Estranged father, critical siblings, distanced in-laws, and the media spotlight never letting up. Tina's advice becomes almost prophetic in its implications. Apologize. Give in. Prioritize relationships. It's the missing formula for resolving conflict, the formula Meghan hasn't applied anywhere in her public or private life. And the audience, ever watchful, can see it all. And as if that weren't enough, the narrative deepens. Because Meghan's avoidance of reconciliation didn't just create tension with family members. It impacted how people view her marriage, her children, and her ability to lead or influence. Tina's words, delivered with calm authority, became a mirror reflecting every unresolved issue, every avoided confrontation, and every opportunity for growth Meghan had missed. But just when it seemed the royal rift had reached a point of no return, the next revelation would surface, one that would force Meghan into the spotlight in ways she never anticipated. Tina's advice was no longer just a lesson. It was a challenge, a warning, and a prophecy rolled into one. Have you ever noticed how a single comment can take on a life of its own once it hits the media? Tina Knowles' subtle words, "I always give in and apologize," weren't meant to spark controversy. They were advice, a gentle philosophy on managing disagreements and valuing relationships. But in Meghan Markle's world, where every gesture is magnified, analyzed, and debated, those words became a headline, a meme, a talking point, and a subtle public indictment all at once. Let's break this down. The podcast aired, Meghan smiled, Tina advised, and on the surface, everything seemed calm. But the media thrives on contrast, tension, and narrative. Here's a quiet woman giving advice, and here's a high-profile figure whose life is dominated by estrangement, criticism, and public scrutiny. The media pounced immediately, highlighting irony, dissecting tone, and questioning Meghan's choices. Headlines like Beyoncé's mom subtly roasts Meghan and Tina Knowles drops wisdom Meghan needs circulated globally. The speed was staggering. Social media users clipped the audio, posted transcripts, and debated interpretation. Royal commentators broke down Meghan's reaction frame by frame. Tabloids juxtaposed Tina's words against Meghan's estranged family relationships. And the narrative became explosive. Here was a woman who publicly champions family and empowerment, yet privately maintains estranged ties with her father, siblings, and in-laws. Tina's words became the lens through which all of this was analyzed. And consider this. Meghan's team could not control the narrative. They could not issue a statement clarifying intent, because Tina's advice was not aimed at criticism. The media, however, interpreted it as commentary. This is the double-edged sword of fame. Even a casual podcast conversation can ripple into headlines that define public perception. And for Meghan, it was a reminder that every word, every gesture, and every smile is scrutinized, amplified, and sometimes weaponized. But the media didn't stop there. Analysis segments on talk shows dissected the underlying message. Was Tina offering wisdom, or was she delivering a gentle roast? Some commentators argued that the advice was a soft admonishment, highlighting Meghan's estranged relationships without directly naming her failures. Others speculated about Meghan's internal reaction. Did she feel guilt, defensiveness, or reflection? The ambiguity created endless speculation, which is exactly what media outlets crave. Now, let's layer in the social media storm. Fans of Beyoncé, fans of the royals, critics of Meghan, all chimed in. Memes were created, comments flooded Twitter threads, Instagram posts dissected body language. Hashtags circulated, mixing humor, irony, and critique. The world watched a subtle piece of advice turn into a viral moment, shaping perception of Meghan's character, decisions, and priorities. Tina's words, casual and unassuming, had ignited a global conversation about reconciliation, humility, and family dynamics. And here's where it gets even more intense. Media narratives began connecting Tina's advice to Meghan's larger life patterns: estrangement from her father, siblings, and in-laws, the controversial exit from royal duties, public interviews, and social media commentary. Every detail, every action, every avoidance of reconciliation was now filtered through Tina's wisdom. A single statement from a podcast became a mirror reflecting a lifetime of relational choices. Ask yourself, how does a public figure navigate this level of scrutiny? Every interaction, even a nod or smile during a conversation, becomes symbolic. Every decision, from philanthropy to interviews, is interpreted through the lens of family loyalty and humility. Meghan's life is a constant balancing act, and Tina's words, though delivered in a private moment of guidance, suddenly dictated the standard by which she was being judged. And let's not forget the irony. Tina Knowles is not royalty. She is not under the same pressures as Meghan in the public eye. Yet, her philosophy, delivered calmly and without fanfare, exposes the very gaps Meghan struggles to fill. The media capitalized on this contrast. Articles ran side by side, Tina's calm wisdom versus Meghan's complicated family saga. It became a narrative almost too perfect to ignore. Then came the expert analysis. Psychologists, relationship coaches, and royal commentators weighed in. They explained why Tina's advice works, why humility and apology strengthen family ties, and why estrangement damages emotional health. They dissected Meghan's patterns, comparing her avoidance tactics with Tina's philosophy. The consensus was clear. Meghan's choices reflected a missed opportunity to apply simple, effective strategies that could have repaired multiple relationships. And the emotional impact on the audience was profound. Readers and viewers began reflecting on their own family relationships. Could they be guilty of similar avoidance? Could a small gesture of humility prevent years of conflict? Tina's advice had transcended the podcast. It had entered the public consciousness as a lesson in human behavior, family loyalty, and emotional intelligence. And for Meghan, it was unavoidable. But the media didn't stop at commentary. Investigative pieces began connecting the dots between Meghan's estranged relationships and public statements about empowerment, family, and responsibility. Every article, every video, every podcast episode referenced Tina's advice as a benchmark. Suddenly, a simple statement about giving in and apologizing became a yardstick for measuring Meghan's integrity, empathy, and personal growth. And here's the twist. While Tina's words were subtle, their reach was massive. The media, operating in a cycle of constant analysis, transformed advice into a narrative about accountability. Meghan's actions, or lack thereof, were no longer private. They were evidence in a global conversation about family, loyalty, and public persona. Every listener became a judge, every viewer a commentator, every reader a participant in the ongoing scrutiny. Imagine being Meghan. You participate in a podcast, nod along, and smile politely. You do not anticipate the ripple effect, the headlines, the viral moments, or the public analysis. And yet, Tina's words, calm and unassuming, have created a lens through which the world now interprets every aspect of your life. Every estranged relationship, every missed reconciliation, every carefully curated public image is suddenly subject to comparison, critique, and judgment. Ask yourself, how would you respond if the world interpreted your private moments as public lessons? How would you react if a single piece of advice became a narrative about your character, values, and family loyalty? For Meghan, this is not hypothetical. It is reality. And Tina Knowles' podcast moment was the spark that ignited this global examination. And just when it seemed the media scrutiny had reached its peak, the next revelation hit. A deeper layer that tied Tina's advice not just to Meghan's family or royal relations, but to her very public persona, her influence, and the way the world perceives her every move. Have you ever noticed how quickly public opinion can swing from admiration to scrutiny? How one small moment can ignite an online storm that feels impossible to control? For Meghan Markle, Tina Knowles' seemingly simple advice on the podcast, "I always give in and apologize," became the catalyst for one of the most intense waves of public backlash she has faced in years. What was intended as a gentle lesson about family and humility transformed overnight into a global debate about her character, choices, and values. The first wave hit social media. Within hours of the podcast airing, Twitter threads exploded with commentary. Fans of Beyoncé celebrated Tina's wisdom, framing it as a masterclass in family diplomacy. Royal observers, however, quickly jumped on the irony. A woman who has been publicly estranged from her father, half-siblings, and in-laws being advised on reconciliation. Memes circulated, highlighting perceived hypocrisy. Instagram Reels dissected Meghan's reactions frame by frame. The message was clear. The world saw a disconnect between advice given and advice applied. Next came the tabloid coverage. Headlines framed Tina's words as a subtle jab at Meghan. Phrases like Beyoncé's mom roasts Meghan Markle and podcast advice hits a nerve appeared across multiple outlets. Journalists dissected every sentence, analyzing tone, context, and implication. Experts on family dynamics and royal relations offered commentary on how Meghan's life patterns mirrored the estrangement Tina was addressing. Every mention reinforced the narrative of a public figure struggling to practice what she preaches. And it wasn't just criticism. Some coverage expressed frustration and disappointment. Columnists pondered why a woman with so much influence and public goodwill seemed unable to navigate her own family relationships. Discussions of hypocrisy, missed opportunities for reconciliation, and the human cost of estrangement dominated both print and digital media. Tina's advice, calm and simple in delivery, had become a lens through which the world judged Meghan's life choices. The emotional intensity of the backlash was amplified by the global nature of Meghan's audience. Unlike private family disputes, this situation unfolded across continents. People from the US, the UK, Canada, and beyond weighed in. Cultural interpretations varied, but the underlying theme remained consistent. Meghan's response to estrangement was scrutinized, compared, and often condemned. Tina's words became a symbolic benchmark for emotional intelligence, humility, and relational responsibility, areas where Meghan was now being questioned. But here's where it gets even more complex. The backlash didn't just reflect personal opinion. It started influencing professional relationships, philanthropic engagements, and public perception. Media cycles framed her as someone who struggles with conflict resolution, which could color everything from documentary reception to book deals, interviews, and partnerships. Tina's advice, though unrelated to professional endeavors, suddenly became a yardstick for judging competence, character, and credibility. Let's talk about psychological impact. For someone like Meghan, this type of global scrutiny can be intense, even overwhelming. Every gesture is magnified, every decision analyzed, every interaction judged. Tina's advice, which might have been received as helpful or advisory in private, became public fodder. It highlighted inconsistencies between personal behavior and public image, forcing Meghan to confront criticism not just from family, but from the entire world. And then came the memes. They were relentless. Users on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter took Tina's words, added humorous captions, and juxtaposed them against photos of Meghan at events, family gatherings, and royal engagements. The humor, while light-hearted to some, carried undertones of criticism. It wasn't just a joke. It was a commentary on missed opportunities, pride, and relational avoidance. Tina's advice had transcended a podcast. It was now a cultural touchstone for discussions of family, humility, and accountability. But the backlash didn't stop at humor. Thoughtful analysis and opinion pieces emerged, questioning why Meghan had chosen distance over reconciliation. Writers examined patterns in her estrangement from her father, siblings, and in-laws, linking these choices to broader themes in her public persona. How could someone advocating for women's empowerment struggle to apply the same principles in their personal life? How could someone preaching compassion fail to reconcile with estranged family? Tina's advice had, intentionally or not, exposed these contradictions. And here's the kicker. The backlash also sparked debate among fans and critics alike about empathy versus judgment. Some argued that Meghan's choices were justified, given media intrusion, family conflicts, and the pressures of royal life. Others contended that humility, apology, and compromise could have prevented years of estrangement. Tina's words became the fulcrum of these debates, a simple phrase illustrating a complex dynamic between expectation, behavior, and perception. Imagine the tension. Meghan is aware that her personal relationships, her public image, and her credibility are being dissected in real time. Every movement, every statement, every decision is now filtered through the lens of Tina's advice. The world is watching, debating, and critiquing, and there's no escaping the implications. The backlash is a reminder that in public life, private advice can become a lightning rod for scrutiny and judgment. And just when it seemed that the public backlash had reached its peak, the media landscape shifted. Analysts began linking Tina's advice to Meghan's broader narrative about family, independence, and empowerment. The discussion moved from personal estrangement to larger themes. How do public figures balance personal values with family obligations? How does one reconcile independence with connection? Tina's words, initially a small advisory comment, had sparked a philosophical debate about leadership, morality, and relational responsibility. And the timing couldn't have been more dramatic. The podcast aired during a period when Meghan and Harry's recent projects were already under intense media scrutiny. Their interviews, philanthropic efforts, and public appearances were being dissected for signs of conflict, reconciliation, or change. Tina's advice provided a new angle, a subtle critique that journalists could integrate into ongoing narratives about the couple. The global conversation expanded, layering public backlash over ongoing curiosity about Meghan's life choices. But the most striking element, despite the global criticism, despite memes, headlines, and debates, Meghan had no way to immediately counter the narrative. Tina's words were calm, simple, and seemingly innocuous, but they carried immense interpretive power. The backlash was a reminder that even gentle advice can become a prism through which public figures are evaluated, and that perception often outweighs intent. And just when you think the storm might settle, the next twist hits, one that escalates the stakes beyond memes, commentary, and analysis, threatening to intertwine Meghan's private decisions with global discourse in a way she could no longer control. Have you ever received advice that seemed simple at the moment, only to realize later that it carried the weight of a lifetime? That's exactly what happened during Meghan Markle's podcast conversation with Tina Knowles. A casual remark, "I always give in and apologize," that might have seemed like everyday wisdom became an unrelenting mirror reflecting Meghan's choices, her relationships, and the public's perception of her. What was meant as a private lesson in humility and reconciliation transformed into a global teaching moment, and the lessons were impossible to ignore. Let's break this down. The podcast aired, Meghan smiled, Tina advised, and on the surface, everything seemed calm. But the media thrives on contrast, tension, and narrative. Here's a quiet woman giving advice, and here's a high-profile figure whose life is dominated by estrangement, criticism, and public scrutiny. The media pounced immediately, highlighting irony, dissecting tone, and questioning Meghan's choices. Headlines like Beyoncé's mom subtly roasts Meghan and Tina Knowles drops wisdom Meghan needs circulated globally. The speed was staggering. Social media users clipped the audio, posted transcripts, and debated interpretation. Royal commentators broke down Meghan's reaction frame by frame. Tabloids juxtaposed Tina's words against Meghan's estranged family relationships. And the narrative became explosive. Here was a woman who publicly champions family and empowerment, yet privately maintains estranged ties with her father, siblings, and in-laws. Tina's words became the lens through which all of this was analyzed. And consider this. Meghan's team could not control the narrative. They could not issue a statement clarifying intent, because Tina's advice was not aimed at criticism. The media, however, interpreted it as commentary. This is the double-edged sword of fame. Even a casual podcast conversation can ripple into headlines that define public perception. And for Meghan, it was a reminder that every word, every gesture, and every smile is scrutinized, amplified, and sometimes weaponized. But the media didn't stop there. Analysis segments on talk shows dissected the underlying message. Was Tina offering wisdom, or was she delivering a gentle roast? Some commentators argued that the advice was a soft admonishment, highlighting Meghan's estranged relationships without directly naming her failures. Others speculated about Meghan's internal reaction. Did she feel guilt, defensiveness, or reflection? The ambiguity created endless speculation, which is exactly what media outlets crave. Now, let's layer in the social media storm. Fans of Beyoncé, fans of the royals, critics of Meghan, all chimed in. Memes were created, comments flooded Twitter threads, Instagram posts dissected body language. Hashtags circulated, mixing humor, irony, and critique. The world watched a subtle piece of advice turn into a viral moment, shaping perception of Meghan's character, decisions, and priorities. Tina's words, casual and unassuming, had ignited a global conversation about reconciliation, humility, and family dynamics. And here's where it gets even more intense. Media narratives began connecting Tina's advice to Meghan's larger life patterns: estrangement from her father, siblings, and in-laws, the controversial exit from royal duties, public interviews, and social media commentary. Every detail, every action, every avoidance of reconciliation was now filtered through Tina's wisdom. A single statement from a podcast became a mirror reflecting a lifetime of relational choices. Ask yourself, how does a public figure navigate this level of scrutiny? Every interaction, even a nod or smile during a conversation, becomes symbolic. Every decision, from philanthropy to interviews, is interpreted through the lens of family loyalty and humility. Meghan's life is a constant balancing act, and Tina's words, though delivered in a private moment of guidance, suddenly dictated the standard by which she was being judged. And let's not forget the irony. Tina Knowles is not royalty. She is not under the same pressures as Meghan in the public eye. Yet, her philosophy, delivered calmly and without fanfare, exposes the very gaps Meghan struggles to fill. The media capitalized on this contrast. Articles ran side by side, Tina's calm wisdom versus Meghan's complicated family saga. It became a narrative almost too perfect to ignore. Then came the expert analysis. Psychologists, relationship coaches, and royal commentators weighed in. They explained why Tina's advice works, why humility and apology strengthen family ties, and why estrangement damages emotional health. They dissected Meghan's patterns, comparing her avoidance tactics with Tina's philosophy. The consensus was clear. Meghan's choices reflected a missed opportunity to apply simple, effective strategies that could have repaired multiple relationships. And the emotional impact on the audience was profound. Readers and viewers began reflecting on their own family relationships. Could they be guilty of similar avoidance? Could a small gesture of humility prevent years of conflict? Tina's advice had transcended the podcast. It had entered the public consciousness as a lesson in human behavior, family loyalty, and emotional intelligence. And for Meghan, it was unavoidable. But the media didn't stop at commentary. Investigative pieces began connecting the dots between Meghan's estranged relationships and public statements about empowerment, family, and responsibility. Every article, every video, every podcast episode referenced Tina's advice as a benchmark. Suddenly, a simple statement about giving in and apologizing became a yardstick for measuring Meghan's integrity, empathy, and personal growth. And here's the twist. While Tina's words were subtle, their reach was massive. The media, operating in a cycle of constant analysis, transformed advice into a narrative about accountability. Meghan's actions, or lack thereof, were no longer private. They were evidence in a global conversation about family, loyalty, and public persona. Every listener became a judge, every viewer a commentator, every reader a participant in the ongoing scrutiny. Imagine being Meghan. You participate in a podcast, nod along, and smile politely. You do not anticipate the ripple effect, the headlines, the viral moments, or the public analysis. And yet, Tina's words, calm and unassuming, have created a lens through which the world now interprets every aspect of your life. Every estranged relationship, every missed reconciliation, every carefully curated public image is suddenly subject to comparison, critique, and judgment. Ask yourself, how would you respond if the world interpreted your private moments as public lessons? How would you react if a single piece of advice became a narrative about your character, values, and family loyalty? For Meghan, this is not hypothetical. It is reality. And Tina Knowles' podcast moment was the spark that ignited this global examination. And just when it seemed the media scrutiny had reached its peak, the next revelation hit. A deeper layer that tied Tina's advice not just to Meghan's family or royal relations, but to her very public persona, her influence, and the way the world perceives her every move. Have you ever noticed how quickly public opinion can swing from admiration to scrutiny? How one small moment can ignite an online storm that feels impossible to control? For Meghan Markle, Tina Knowles' seemingly simple advice on the podcast, "I always give in and apologize," became a catalyst for one of the most intense waves of public backlash she has faced in years. What was intended as a